Hello everyone, this is Shannon for Waffle Flower Crafts. In today's video, we are going to play with pigment ink and dye ink. We're going to layer them together and going to create some really fun patterns on craft cardstock. I'm going to start today's cards with the color combos for Inkpads Stamp Set. This just came out in Waffle Flower's August release, and I have an A2 top folding card base made out of craft cardstock. This is actually a lightweight craft, it's only 65 pound, and I will later add a 110 pound white cardstock base to this card to thicken it up a little bit. I'm going to start with my pigment ink. This is Stays On Pigment Ink. It is Snowflake, and I'm going to ink up the smallest triangle from the stamp set, and I just mounted it here on an acrylic block, and I'm just going to hand stamp this card front. So I inked it up and then I will stamp it. I really like this pigment ink. It performs beautifully. It dries really quick, which is very unique for a pigment ink, and it also, I think, has a really nice opaque coverage, so it does a really good job for this white onto the craft. You can see how nice and white it is. As you can see here, I'm repeat stamping this triangle. I'm creating kind of just a random pattern. I've started at the right, I'm working my way over to the left. I'll probably stamp about 2/3 up this card front, and I'm kind of thinking of this like I'm going to make little squares, so I don't actually complete the squares. I don't actually stamp two triangles kind of right next to each other, so I create a square. I always leave the other half kind of open, and I'm just repeating this at the top as well, just a little bit, to kind of do both corners or both opposite corners. Now that I finished stamping my pattern, I'm going to let this dry before I move on to the dye ink. While that's drying, I'm going to quickly clean my stamp off here. Just with a damp chamois, the Stays On ink doesn't come off, or the Stays On pigment ink doesn't come off, and you actually need to use a cleaner to clean it up. So I just have a cleaner here that I'm just going to rub over the stamp as well as my acrylic block, and then just quickly clean that up. So don't be surprised if that Stays On ink doesn't come off your stamp. You just need to clean it with a stamp cleaner, and you can see here everything is nice and clean now. So now I'm going to move on to my dye ink, and I've only let that pigment ink dry for maybe like 5 minutes, so not very long, just as long as it took me to clean my stamp. Now I have some Waffle Flower dye inks, and I have a rainbow of them, and I'm going to just start with red, and I am going to follow them in rainbow order. They're off screen in the correct order, so that just helps me keep it straight. And I'm just going to ink up the square. Again, the square stamp is from the color combos for Inkpads Stamp Set, the same stamp set that had the triangle, and I'm just inking them up with my rainbow colors of dye ink, and then just stamping right on top of a section of this pattern that I created with the pigment ink. I'm going to repeat this process until I have basically all of those white triangles covered with some dye ink. This goes really fast, and I really enjoy watching this kind of pattern get completed. I did grab that triangle again that we used for the pigment ink and mounted it on another acrylic block and just stamped that little green triangle that you see there. I do like to have the squares kind of broken up a little bit, and I prefer the dye ink over just the white ink by itself. So I'll do that on this corner as well. I'll do that once, but I'm just continuing the same process for the other half. This whole pattern actually really reminds me of It's a Small World. I don't know if it's kind of the triangles and just kind of the geometric shapes or the rainbow colors, but I really enjoyed how this card turned out, and I love the look of the dye ink on the craft paper and also over the white pigment ink. I think it just has a really cool kind of velvety and rich look. So now I'm going to move on to my sentiment. I did actually trim this card base down. I trimmed it about 1/8 of an inch on either side, so now it's actually 5.5 by 4, and that way I can have a little bit of white from my white card base that I mentioned earlier, my 110 pound white card base that I'm going to add to the inside of this card to thicken it up. But you also see a little bit of sliver of white on the side there, and that just adds a nice grounding edge, I think. And that white card base is actually a little bit shorter than 5.5. You want to cut off about 1/8 of an inch, and when you remove that from the bottom, it will make sure that that white card base will fit nicely in between the craft card base. So I've grabbed a sentiment here from the Big Dot Sentiment Stamp Set, and I'm going to use my Misty to stamp it. I first put down some anti-static powder. It's really important that this all your ink that you just stamped, all that dye ink and pigment ink, is ink is completely dry, so I did heat set this before I stamped my sentiment, and then I just white embossed that sentiment. Now I'm going to adhere the two card bases together. I'm going to use, because that is a thin card base, that craft cardstock is thin, it's only 65, I'm going to use my tape runner. I am typically a liquid glue girl, but it doesn't work out so good when you have thinner cardstock. And I'm just running it on both sides of the craft paper and then sticking the two together. I am using kind of my work surface to kind of help me get the bottom edge or the side edge really nice and straight and perfectly together. And once I get those two together, my card is done. That's simple. It's a nice simple card, almost a one-layer card if I didn't add the inside card base. And I have a couple other cards to show you guys as well. One of my favorite things to do is create patterns and play with color, so I just had a lot of fun with this technique with the same stamp set. This is the large triangle from the Color Combos Inkpads Stamp Set, and I just stamped a really simple design. I think it fits really well with the sending you happy mail sentiment. And here's another one. I used the medium triangle, the large triangle, and kind of created almost the look of mountains. And that's all my cards. And I think there's so many other shapes I didn't even use. I just stuck with the triangles. I think this has a lot of possibilities. I hope you guys enjoyed today's cards and videos. If you want any more information on the products I'm using, please visit Waffle Flower, and you can follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook for more creative ideas. Thanks for watching. Have a wonderful day.